Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Dina McFeeters, honored as always to serve as Associate Minister here. Our opening words are called A Shared Story by Sandra Fees. For the stories that long to be told and retold, for the stories that long to be imagined and reimagined, for the stories that long to be envisioned and celebrated, we kindle this chalice. May its flame bring the light of different truths, of different paths, and different voices, all needed to cultivate a transformative story of justice, love, and beauty. Will you join in singing our opening song, which is printed on the insert in your order of service? Please rise in body or spirit. Desiree will lead us, and we'll sing it just 3 times through. I think we know it now. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change, alive from deep within the earth. It is time now
Good morning. I am Reverend Kimberly Tomchuk Carlson, and it is my honor to serve as your Minister of Religious Education. The story I have for you today is called The Gigantic Turnip, and it's by Alexei Tolstoy and Niam Sharkey. Long ago, an old man and an old woman lived together in a crooked old cottage with a large, overgrown garden. The old man and the old woman kept 6 yellow canaries, 5 white geese, 4 speckled hens, 3 black cats, 2 pot-bellied pigs, and 1 brown cow. On a fine March morning, the old woman sat up, sniffed the sweet spring air, and said, "It's time for us to sow vegetables." Clearly, they don't live in Wisconsin. So the old man and the old woman went out into the garden, and they sowed peas and carrots and potatoes and beans, and last of all, they sowed turnips. And that night, rain fell, pitter-patter, on the garden and the old crooked cottage. And the old man and the old woman, well, they smiled as they slept because they knew that the rain would help the seeds swell and produce fine, juicy vegetables. Spring passed, and the summer sun ripened the vegetables. The old man and the old woman harvested the carrots and the potatoes and the beans and the peas and turnips. But at the end of the row of turnips, there was 1 turnip left. It looked very big. In fact, it looked gigantic. On a fine September morning, the old man sat up in bed, sniffed the cold air, the late summer air, and said, "It's time for us to pull up that turnip." And out they went. The old man pulled and heaved and tugged and yanked, but the turnip would not move. The old man went to find the old woman. And the old woman wrapped her arms around the waist of the man, and both of them pulled and heaved and yanked and tugged, but still that turnip would not move. So the old woman went to fetch the big brown cow, and the old man and the old woman and the big brown cow pulled and heaved and tugged and yanked, but still that turnip would not move. So the man mopped his brow and went to fetch the 2 pot-bellied pigs. And the old man and the old woman and the big brown cow and the 2 pot-bellied pigs pulled and yanked and heaved and tugged, and still nothing with that turnip. So the old woman rolled up her sleeves and went to fetch the 3 black cats. And the old woman and the old man and the big brown cow and the 2 pot-bellied pigs and the 3 black cats pulled and heaved and tugged and yanked, but still that turnip would not move. So one of the cats twitched her tails and went to fetch the 4 speckled hens. And the old man and the old woman and the big brown cow and the 2 pot-bellied pigs and the 3 black cats and the 4 speckled hens pulled and heaved and tugged and yanked, and still that turnip, well, it wouldn't move. So one of the hens shook her feathers and went to fetch the 5 geese. Guess what? The old man and the old woman and the big brown cow and the 2 pot-bellied pigs and the 3 black cats and the 4 speckled hens and the 5 white geese pulled and heaved and tugged and yanked. Still, the turnip wouldn't move. So one of the geese craned her neck and went to fetch the 6 yellow canaries. And the old man and the old woman and the big brown cow and the 2 pot-bellied pigs and the 3 black cats and the 4 speckled hens and the 5 white geese and the 6 yellow canaries, they pulled and they heaved and they tugged and they yanked. Still, the turnip would not move. The old man scratched his head, and the animals and the birds lay on the ground gasping, and the old woman had an idea. She went into the kitchen with a tiny piece of cheese, and she put it in the mouse hole. And soon a hungry little mouse popped out its head, and the old woman caught the mice, and they carried it outside. And the old man and the old woman and the big brown cow and the 2 pot-bellied pigs and the 3 black cats and the 4 speckled hens and the 5 white geese and the 6 yellow canaries and the little hungry mouse pulled and heaved and tugged and yanked, and pop! The gigantic turnip finally came flying out of the ground, and everyone fell over, and the canaries fell on the mouse, and the geese fell on the canaries, and the hens fell on the geese, and the cats fell on the hens, and the pigs fell on the cats, and the cow fell on the pigs, and the old woman fell on the cow, and the old man fell on the old woman. And all of them lay on the ground and just laughed. Who knew it would take everyone working together to pull up that old turnip? And that night, the old man and the old woman made a huge bowl of turnip stew. and everyone ate as much as they could. And do you know what? That little hungry mouse ate most of all. The end.
As we enter into a time of centering with spoken meditation, followed by shared silence, followed by the seated singing of hymn 123, Spirit of Life, I'd invite you to find a way to ground and center yourselves in your body, in this place where you are, and in this time, however that works for you. You might bring attention to your feet. You might bring attention to how your spine is resting and supporting you. You might bring attention to the sensation of the air on your skin, or how your breath is coming in and moving out of your lungs. This meditation is called Prayer of Storytelling by Mandy McGlynn. Spirit of life and love, Holy One of our being and our becoming, that which is sacred within, among, and beyond us. We know so many stories about you, God, Lord, King, Father, Earth Mother, Great Spirit, Universe, Holy Parent, Divine Love, deepest longings, covenanted partner. We know stories about our country and its founding, about the values we claim as a people. We have stories about those values and how they have and have not manifested in our reality. Blessed One, we also know so many stories about ourselves, some of them the same stories we tell about others, called beautiful, ugly, simple, difficult, joyous, useful, worthless. Stories about who we are and are not, what we know, and the potentials and impossibilities of our future. Stories about our purpose and the meaning of our lives. Above all, today, Holy Parent, sing us a gentle lullaby in the trees and the wind, in the kind words of our neighbors, in the warmth of the sun and the sparkle of the light. Whisper to us the truest story you know, and sing it to us in notes we can never unhear. Remind us every day, every moment, that we are beloved, beloved, beloved. May it be so.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. I'm Tom Hester, and I'm pleased to serve as your worship associate today. We are a faith community of many identities. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all you are carrying today and all your heart longs to put down. We also welcome everyone who's watching online. Hello, online folks. And we particularly welcome guests joining us today. If you are a visiting guest, we invite you to fill out a welcome card located in a pew rack in front of you and drop it off in offering plates that will come around in a few minutes. After the service, please join us for a social hour across the hall in the Lee House Common Room. Some accessibility notes. You can find hearing assist devices and large print hymnals and orders of service at the back of the sanctuary, as well as worship activity bags for children and anyone who wants them. There's a fragrance-free area in the front right pews. If you're watching online, you can enable YouTube's closed captioning on your viewing device. I welcome you to share in our first church worship and purpose by inviting you to join me in a unison affirmation of our mission, which is printed in your order of service. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. Well done. Every week we have the opportunity to practice our values for sharing our resources. Our pledges are at the core of our spiritual practice of generosity. In addition, the church often shares half of its pledged cash with another community organization. But today is different. Today we share 100% of all non-pledged cash in our offering plate to the UUA Disaster Relief Fund for the LA wildfires. To contribute, put cash or checks made out to UUA Disaster Relief Fund in the offering plate, and we will forward it for you. Or text 73256 with the message, "Give to UU." The offering will now be gratefully received as we sing, seated, Children's Recessional Hymn, number 212. I invite all children, youth, and RE volunteers to sing the first verse and then follow Reverend Kimberly to the Lee House Common Room and then downstairs for religious education. If your child needs to check in for RE, please accompany them. May the practice of giving bring us joy. At holiday and other gatherings, most families share stories. The same stories, repeatedly told over the years, become traditions that bring a sense of belonging and rootedness. In my family, many of the stories are about me and my brother Dan during our free-range childhood. Here are just a few headliners. The broken oboe. The missing wooden spoon. Uncle Wally and the breadboard. And the Avon hair trainer. My family knows the story behind the headlines. The rented oboe that broke during a tussle between me and Dan. When we hid my mother's go-to wooden punishment spoon and delighted in her exasperation when she couldn't find it to address our not too infrequent misbehavior. Uncle Wally hiding a breadboard under his shirt when he dared me to punch his amazing abdominals. And my persistent but futile resistance to my mother's efforts to style my hair with greasy Avon hair trainer. But the story I want to tell you today is a family story that greatly shaped my self-image and the direction of my life. This is a story of the coach and the athlete. As a boy growing up in Wisconsin, I dreamt of playing running back for the Green Bay Packers, like my idols Jim Taylor or Paul Hornung. I believed I possessed the requisite speed, agility, and toughness to be a star. But my dreams and self-image were about to change. In 6th grade, I had my first male teacher, Mr. Doro, and what a man he was. A former U.S. Marine drill sergeant who even played football with the students during recess. I wanted to demonstrate how good I was at football and was the only student to fearlessly ram into him for a tackle or a block. My brother Dan had Mr. Doro as his teacher 2 years later. Shortly after my mother attended a parent-teacher conference about Dan, she reported to me what Mr. Doro had concluded about each of her sons. Dan was going to become an outstanding athlete, and I had the makings of a good coach. A coach, I felt myself deflating into a rumble of broken dreams. But it got worse. In my freshman year of high school, my gym teacher was screening his class to find candidates for the football team by timing all of us in a 40-yard dash. This was my chance for redemption. I just knew I would be the fastest. Alas, even after my best efforts and 2 tries, I was squarely in the lower half of the class. But I was still determined to play football and asked my mother for permission to enroll in summer practices. She didn't want me to play and thought I'd get hurt. I'm sure she was influenced by Mr. Doro's assessment regarding my lack of athletic ability. Instead, she wanted me to join the debate team and drama club. We reached a compromise: debate, drama, and football. I prepared by running, lifting weights, and organizing neighborhood football games. I also began working with Dan on his football skills. I devised receiving drills and centered the ball for his punts, unwittingly fulfilling the role of coach. The results? I became a starting right tackle, long snapper, and captain of the debate team. Dan was the starting wingback, defensive back, and punter. He went to the state tournament in wrestling and was a champion high hurdler and later played college football. Dan then went on to become a grade school principal, but his athletic legend continued. Shortly after coming to First Church, I met a member here who attended the same high school I did. He, like my brother, was a high hurdler who said the track coach couldn't stop talking about my brother, Danny Hester. I was so proud and envious. As an adult, I went on to become a clinical and administrative psychiatrist and found my coaching skills to be useful in assisting patients, students, and mental health professionals. Perhaps this is my redemption. I lived up to my family's story, but in my own way.
When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jewish people, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Medjrik, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, "Master of the universe, listen. I do not know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer." And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sesav, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, "I do not know how to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and that must be sufficient." It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. Then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Ritzen to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God, "I am unable to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and that must be sufficient." And it was sufficient. Misfortune was overcome. Perhaps some of you have heard that story before. Perhaps it spoke to you when you heard it, or perhaps not. If it did not speak to you, perhaps you had no context for it. For a variety of reasons, maybe you're not part of the Jewish tradition, maybe you were not experiencing oppression or the need to avert disaster when you heard the story. Perhaps you did not know that Holocaust survivor Elia Wiesel told that story in one of his many books. The pattern in that story builds on the strength of repetition and the message that even when we are at a generational distance from that recipe for spiritual power, even when we can't remember all the things we are supposed to do to bring about the miracle of saving our people, if we can just tell the story again, it will give us strength. We know that repetition in our daily routines helps during times of trauma and during challenges to our mental health, as long as they are healthy patterns. And stories can be a part of that. What are the stories that you repeat because they help you find your way when you cannot remember how to find your way? What are the stories your family tells and retells, the stories your friends tell and retell that ground you and give you strength? What are the stories that you return to during times of crisis? When a country elects a tyrant, the tyrant does devastating things. I don't watch horror movies because they are too frightening. But every headline in the news since Monday is a horror movie. Except it's not a movie. It's real. The tyrant who holds the highest office in our country is doing the devastating things he said he would do. He is doing them swiftly, dismantling centuries of carefully built democracy with a strike of his pen, putting Earth and millions of people in real danger. He is using a shock and awe strategy to intimidate, to strike fear deep within us, rendering us incapable of response from sheer overwhelm and horror. And we are feeling deep fear, grief, and devastation this week, especially the most vulnerable among us. But we are not a people who give in to overwhelm and horror, at least not for long. We are people who grab onto our moral compass. In times of crisis like this, we articulate our values again and again, reminding ourselves and others, and use our moral compass to guide our actions. We tell each other stories that inspire us and make us brave. Perhaps you are familiar with the poetic reading that came from a 1946 post-war confessional speech by German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller about the silent complicity of intellectuals and clergy following the Nazis' rise to power. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Over the decades, marginalized people have written themselves into this litany. Then they came for the disabled people. Then they came for the people of color. Then they came for the women. Then they came for the Palestinians. Then they came for the queer people. Then they came for the immigrants, and so on. There is a meme going around this week that says, first, they came for the trans people. And I spoke out immediately, even though I'm straight and cisgender, because I've read the rest of the effing poem. Right? We know about fascism now, and we've seen the signs in our own country. We know that one of the strategies of fascism is to normalize its horrors through something called creeping normality. The right to reproductive health care gradually chipped away, voting rights chipped away, the free press chipped away, public education chipped away, rule of law chipped away, or completely thrown over like it was this week, until these conditions seem normal. But this, we know this moment of history we are in, this is not normal. This is not normal in a democracy. And we can say so. We can say this is not normal. Timothy Snyder, Yale University history professor, wrote a book called On Tyranny that helps us identify and resist tyranny. He said rule number one for us is do not obey in advance. Do not obey in advance, which means don't give away your power before someone tries to take it from you. Don't adapt early. Don't compromise your values in anticipation of the regime and its cruelty. For example, as we saw, don't stop publishing political cartoons that are critical of the administration. One of the things that I believe can help us during a time of crisis is to tell stories of resistance and take courage from them, and to write ourselves into those stories. We do this all the time with stories in our popular culture. The musical Wicked tells the story of the Wizard of Oz from a different perspective, the perspective of the Wicked Witch of the West. You know this story, but did you notice that the story tries to answer deep theological questions like, why is there wickedness? And it searches for the backstory to a vilified character. We discover a girl who was born with green skin, abandoned by her mother, ignored by her father, bullied at school, betrayed by a teacher, ostracized, alone. Yet she had an unusual magical power that she learned to use to liberate herself. Wicked, the novel, the musical, the movie, is a reinterpretation of a canonical story that has been repeated in our popular imagination. Because repetition is our friend until it isn't, until we need to reinterpret. If your family has told and retold stories about you that harm you, that limit you, that aren't true, then repeating those stories is not your friend. We do not have to accept the stories that are fed to us. We can say they are wrong when they are wrong. Enlarging the scope, when people with institutional power tell stories that harm, that are not true, we can say they are lies. Of course, this gets a little trickier when we're dealing with sacred scriptures. Many UUs come together in congregations not knowing the same stories, not knowing any canon of scripture, yet filled with mistrust because we know the hurt that traditional religion can inflict. We in this room might not have been raised with the stories in the Hebrew scriptures or the Christian scriptures or the Quran or the Vedas or the sutras or the stories of ancient prophets or even modern day prophets, otherwise known as social justice activists. I mean, some of us arrive in UUism as scriptureless people, as unstoried people, seeking community because we feel alone. And we need to write ourselves into a larger story. We don't necessarily know how to draw the thread of continuity from the Black Lives Matter movement back to the story of Pharaoh enslaving the Israelites in Egypt and the movement of resistance that followed Moses up and out of Egypt into freedom. We don't know how to draw that line connecting that old story of cruelty and risk and liberation to tyrants in our own day and time. To connect that thread to the slaves who escaped slavery in our country, connect that thread to the African American spiritual go down Moses and tell old Pharaoh to let my people go, and connect that thread to the Underground Railroad, to the Civil Rights Movement, to Black History Month, to Black Lives Matter, to the moment we are in today. But the threads are there. The stories are there. And the stories within the stories are there if we look for them, if we listen carefully to voices we don't usually hear, the voices of resistance. Do you know the story of the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Puah? Anybody? No, of course you don't. So, let me tell you. Shifra and Puah, they did not obey, not in advance or otherwise, when Pharaoh gave the order to kill the Hebrew babies as soon as they were born. When Pharaoh summoned the midwives to account when they did not do this, the midwives said, oh, these aren't like Egyptian births. We just can't get to the birthing stool fast enough. The babies are born before we can even get there. So sorry. So then Pharaoh took another step in his campaign of oppression. He commanded all the Egyptians to kill the Hebrew babies by throwing them into the Nile. But Moses' mother hid him for 3 months after he was born, so he could not be thrown into the river. And then when she could not hide him anymore, she got a papyrus basket, made it waterproof, and set him in the basket to float among the reeds at the bank of the river. Is this sounding a little familiar now? Yeah, but you didn't know about those midwives, did you? So then, the daughter of Pharaoh comes down to bathe at the river, saw the basket and drew it out of the water. She saw the baby, knew it to be one of the Hebrew babies, and did not obey her father, right? Who was the Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the country, did not kill that baby. Moses' sister, Miriam, who was hiding and watching what happened, offered to take Moses to a Hebrew wet nurse. And guess who that Hebrew wet nurse was? Moses' mother. Clever. Moses' mother nursed the baby, and when the baby grew old enough, Moses' mother brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him and raised him as her own. Isn't that a fascinating Bible story? Featuring all these women who cleverly used their limited power to resist tyranny. Each of them played a role from their unique social location. Yolanda Pierce, professor and dean of Howard University School of Divinity, published a book in 2023 called In My Grandmother's House: Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. And she wrote about her grandmother, that cooking was her ministry. And I witnessed as she ministered to the lonely and the sick and the lost, with a Bible in one hand and a freshly baked pound cake in the other. She fed everyone who came within a 50-foot radius of our door, always greeting people with both food and scripture. She told me that Jesus consistently did 3 things: healed people, told stories, and fed people. And that is all she, as a follower of Jesus, had to do in order to live a life pleasing to God. You may have noticed that the teachings of Jesus are under debate this week, as they have been since he died. Which of Jesus' teachings should we hold as our moral compass if we are living within the larger story of Christianity? Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., the Right Reverend Marion Edgar Buddy, claims that showing mercy and compassion to the most vulnerable people is the most important of Jesus' teachings. Because here's the thing, Scripture exists to be interpreted and applied to our times today. The larger religious stories can give us spiritual power if we reclaim them. We don't have to cede the religious stories to the religious right, to the white supremacists, to the authoritarians. Yolanda Pierce wrote, "When I was growing up, we had a large family Bible in which generations of our family history was recorded. This book occupied a special place in the living room, which was regularly dusted and loved. Births, deaths, and marriages that took place before African Americans could receive official records of these events are all recorded in that book. I grew up with church folks who taught me to love the Bible with all my heart and to care for it with my hands. My love of the text, however, does not blind me to its misuse and abuse," she continues. African American theologian Howard Thurman taught me that a critical reading, a hermeneutic of suspicion, was necessary for genuine understanding. Thurman came to his knowledge of God in his grandmother's house. Mrs. Nancy Ambrose had been born during enslavement, and she took on the task of raising him after his mother's early death. Thurman remembers, "My regular chore was to do all the reading for my grandmother. She could neither read nor write. 2 or 3 times a week, I read the Bible aloud to her, and I was deeply impressed by the fact that she was most particular about the choice of scripture." With a feeling of great temerity, I asked her one day why it was that she would not let me read any of the letters from Paul. During the days of slavery, she said, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. Old man McGee was so mean that he would not let a Negro minister preach to his slaves. Always the white minister used as his text something from Paul, such as, "Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters as unto Christ." Then he would go on to show how it was God's will that we were slaves, and how, if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. I promised my Maker that if I ever learned to read and if freedom ever came, I would not read that part of the Bible. Thurman's grandmother was bold enough to say that simply because it is in the book does not mean it is for me. So I want to encourage us to decide for ourselves when repetition is our friend and when it is not. What are the practices of repetition that ground you and give you strength? For surely we need strength. Are they practices of singing Spirit of Life, memorizing a poem or a quote, telling a family story, or even recalling some piece of some sacred scripture that you grew up with way back when? Because when humans are under severe stress, our brains do go back to early childhood, to those practices that we learn by heart. And if those practices work for you, great. Even if you think you don't believe what is in that practice, if it brings you comfort and strength, you can repeat it. And if not, reclaim or reinterpret or find a new poem or piece of scripture, story, a quote to hold you in spiritual power. I think we also need to claim the community stories that we want to tell over and over to hold us in challenging times, to make us brave, to help us be the voices of conscience, which is indeed the role of the faith community, as Bishop Buddy reminded us in her interviews this week. What are the first church stories, the faith community stories that we need to tell that will help us act for the common good? Is it the story of when First Church sponsored a refugee family? The story of when First Church responded to an emergency call from the Red Cross to shelter women and children overnight in our building for a week when it was very cold and the shelters were full? And legend has it that we did, and within 24 hours of the call, we had mobilized 100 volunteers to do that very thing. Do we tell the story of serving as a safe haven for women who are trying to get past the protesters at the reproductive health clinic just down the street? For those of us who weren't here yet when those events happened, we can write ourselves into those stories as if they are part of us, as if they are part of our DNA, because they are certainly part of the larger DNA of the congregation. And we can tell more recent stories too, right? We can tell the story of our Defend Democracy team and all of what you all did to inspire us, to make us brave. We come to church to tell the stories and to practice our ethical values and our religious values repeatedly for a variety of reasons, but especially in these times, we do that so that fascism doesn't creep into us. We come to church to clearly articulate our values, our morals, and to call each other and those in power back to our humanity. To remind ourselves that we are not powerless and we are not alone. We need each other to write ourselves into a larger story that inspires, that redeems, and that saves. The lives of the most vulnerable among us depend on it. Our closing words are called Naming the Largest Truths by Vanessa Southern. May the stories we tell name the largest truths of what was, of what is, and pull us forward to what should be, as stories were always meant to do. May it be so, and may we make it so. Please rise in body or spirit and join in singing our recessional hymn 95, There is More Love Somewhere.